In 2006, a young man working along the border between the United States and Mexico had an encounter with something that he and his fellow officers were simply not prepared for. What began as a normal evening only got stranger and stranger until they were faced with a life or death situation beyond their wildest dreams. And in the years since, it has come to haunt their every waking moment. You won't want to miss this one. In the early 2000s, Austin was employed by the United States Customs and Border Protection as a Border Patrol agent. And most of the time, it was lonely and uneventful work, scanning the distance for any signs of activity. But when things ramped up, they did so quickly. So even those long nights meant that everyone had to stay alert. When it was time to act, there wasn't any time to prepare. You just had to always be ready. Now, because of the nature of his experience, Austin didn't share exactly where he was stationed. And all we know is that it was somewhere in New Mexico. If he gave away any more, he worried that his friends might easily lose their jobs. He would only share his story under the strictest conditions of anonymity. But here's the thing. Austin had made an oath to protect the people of the country, and while that normally meant just doing his job and ensuring that the southern border stayed secure, he also felt that meant his fellow Americans had every right to know what he experienced in 2006. Now, Austin saw his share of strange things while on Border Patrol. Most of it was just odd things in the sky, but he never put too much thought into those. I mean, after all, there was a nuclear base near where he patrolled, so he always just chalked those things up to like aircraft tests and drones. They were odd, but not anything that he couldn't explain away. And besides that, most of what he was aware of trickled down to him in the form of rumors. Bob saw Chupacabra, Lonnie saw a ghost, things like that. Stories from a friend. But never did he think he would become the source of one of those stories. But folks, all that changed one evening. Now, Austin said that the night in question had started out just like any other. It was him and two other co-workers just pacing around this CBP base, watching the sun as it slowly sunk behind the rugged hills of the New Mexico desert. And it wasn't until darkness fell that they'd truly have to be on high alert. Austin and his co-workers had been assigned the night watch, and they were trying to psych themselves up for it. None of them had a full overnight shift yet, and they were still trying to get their internal schedules synchronized with the long night ahead of them. But it was tough going, and despite having planned to get enough sleep, all three of the agents were fighting exhaustion. I mean, there's only so much that you can do to prep for completely flipping your sleep-wake cycle. You kind of just have to power through the beginning until it feels more natural. And to make matters worse, Austin and the two others spanned an age range from their mid-50s down to their mid-30s. The older you get, the more difficult a drastic change like that can prove. So let me set the scene for you. You see, the base wasn't directly on the US-Mexico border. It was actually more of a checkpoint, a little further in on the American side. There was the occasional border crossing that made it this far, but they weren't exactly on the front lines. There were plenty of people between them and Mexico that could intercept anyone trying to sneak across. For this, it meant that the action would be minimal on their first night shift. Or so they thought. Austin and the two agents settled in for what was going to be a long night, even if it was going to be calm, and for a while at least, it was. Now, out ahead of them, the desert stretched off into the distance, bone white in the harsh glow of the floodlights. Beyond the edge of the light they cast was nothing but solid darkness. Up above, there was no moon to be seen, just an endless void. And if you stopped far enough from these floodlights, you'd see the stars, but they obviously didn't throw off enough light to see by. And in fact, it was disorienting. The sky was brighter than the ground, making it feel like the world had turned on its head long before Austin's world turned upside down itself. The hours ticked by. Some of them stayed alert with generous portions from the coffee pot. Others kept themselves vigilant with frequent smoke breaks, hoping that the nicotine would sharpen their senses. Austin, though, just kept scanning the dark, keeping an eye out for anything. And mostly, he was looking for lights in the distance and keeping his eyes and ears open. But all he heard was the breeze of the wind. Now, around 2:30 o'clock in the morning, silence was broken. The vehicle was still a way off, but it was so quiet out here. It sounded like it was at the base long before they could even see its headlights. But there was no mistaking the hum of tires on the pavement, and it was the first sign of life they had seen all night. Then, at last, 2 faint pinpricks of light ignited in the distance. The headlights drew closer and closer. Everyone was on high alert. Again, it could be nothing, but if it was something, they would only have a heartbeat to react. Bill, the oldest Border Patrol agent, stood up straight from the corner of the guardhouse he had been leaning against, and he said, "Well, if it ain't the first catch of the day." He sighed, put down his coffee, and flicked on his flashlight before heading down the metal steps. Joe, the other guard, tried to correct him and was like, "You mean night, like the first catch of the night." And of course, Bill grumbled something about how that wasn't the saying and took his position by the roadside. And Joe followed him shortly thereafter, as did Austin, who had remained silent this entire time. And everyone took a ready position. The headlights finally fell on the 3 men. This was the most dangerous moments. Whoever was approaching could see them just fine, but they couldn't see a thing beyond the glare of the oncoming car. And thankfully, it started to slow down. Whoever it wasn't planning on ramming through tonight. Maybe it would just be a routine stop. But as the vehicle crept into view of the floodlights, Austin was taken by surprise. And here, out in the middle of the desert, was a beautiful vintage car. It was a 1948 Lincoln Continental. And let me tell you, this thing was spotless. Barely looked like it had been traveling through the desert at all. The paint job gleamed, newly polished with only a few grains of sand on either side. Now, right away, Austin knew something was wrong. The car should not look this good, and plus, it was a bad choice out here. I mean, if that thing broke down, the driver would be stranded. And besides, who in their right mind would have chosen to drive such a prized possession across such a stretch of bad land? There were only a few characters that came to mind for Austin, and none of them suggested anything good. Now, slowly, the Lincoln Continental coasted to a stop by the security checkpoint. And that was when things went from odd to unsettling. The moment the old car halted, all the lights on the base started flickering. This raised even more alarm bells for Austin. A power outage at the base would constitute a genuine emergency, but now the floodlights were winking in and out, and in those brief moments of darkness, the only thing lighting up the checkpoint was the 3 agents' flashlights and the headlights of the phantom car parked at the gate. Austin reacted instinctively. He rushed to the nearest circuit breaker, his mind racing about the weird timing, and never before had the electricity on the base faltered at all. That, coupled with the arrival of the Lincoln Continental, well, it just didn't feel right. So now, Austin is fumbling with the breaker box, but it isn't too far away, and he's still within earshot of his coworkers, and he could see everything just fine. At least as fine as could be expected, with all the power going in and out. Luckily, Bill and Joe kept their cool, and Bill starts asking the usual questions. Austin looks over his shoulder just as Bill shines his flashlight on the driver's face, and, well, let's just say that what he sees doesn't calm Austin down in the slightest. The person behind the wheel, a white-haired elderly man, maybe around 65, with a collection of expensive rings gleaming on each finger, has a strange, unsettling smile just plastered across his face. It reveals rows of yellow teeth protruding from dark gums. His hair is white as snow. He's wearing a nice, buttoned-up dress shirt and black necktie, but his eyes, they're just a little too wide, and they aren't even blinking, even in spite of the dust that the Lincoln just kicked up. And even from where he stands, fiddling with the circuit box, Austin can tell this isn't the way tonight is supposed to go. The driver's voice is strange too. There's no emotion in it. It's cold and raspy, bordering on robotic. At this time, that smile is still frozen in place. And Austin is torn because he needs to get the lights working reliably again, but he just can't shake this feeling. He manages to pry his attention from the stopped car long enough to examine the breaker box more closely, but this only deepens his confusion. Austin didn't know what to expect, but he expected to see some sort of problem to fix. And inside the breaker box, there's obviously nothing wrong. There's no water damage, no loose wires, nothing of the sort. All of the equipment inside seems to be in perfect condition. So Austin gives up, and it's been a few minutes since the lights flickered, so maybe it was just a momentary glitch. Now, in the meantime, they still have a job to do, and Austin is more convinced by the minute that Bill and Joe, well, they're going to need his help. And so Bill's asking the driver for his ID and asking to see in the passenger side. So far, so good. And Austin moves back to the security booth where Joe has taken a position nearby. Immediately, Joe whispers to Austin the exact same thing that he's been thinking. He asks Austin, "Hey, is it just me or does this guy seem weird? I mean, look at him. He hasn't blinked once." In the light of his flashlight, Austin can see that Joe's eyes are almost as wide as the driver's, but he's blinking normally. He's just downright spooked. Now, Austin glances in the direction of Bill, who is still interrogating this driver. He nods but ignores the question. Instead, he says, "I didn't find anything wrong with the circuit breaker. It's something we ought to report." And with that, Austin reaches down for his walkie-talkie, thumbs the button, but it doesn't respond. It's dead. Austin just says, "Hey Joe, my walkie just broke out of the blue. Mind if you report that in for me?" And now Joe takes a step or two over to the desk, grabs his, he brings it to his mouth and starts speaking, but after just a second or two, his also dies. And neither of the men say a word, they just exchange glances. All they need to see that they share in the same general uneasiness. Joe and Austin take a good look at Bill. He's out there alongside the car, still interacting with the driver. And after a few moments, he looks in the direction of the guardhouse. Both Austin and Joe can tell that he's upset, and now he's signaling for them to come over and inspect the vehicle with him. Time to see what this old weirdo has in his car. Now, this is standard protocol. But Austin feels a wave of dread wash over him as he and Joe plod down the steps to the checkpoint. The driver steps out, and so does a second figure from the passenger side. It's a woman, presumably, the driver's wife. And she's odd too. She has a bob haircut and is dressed to the nines. Well, that's not exactly right. She's dressed to the nines the way someone would have been in the 1950s, and she, like her husband, looks filthy, stinking rich, covered in jewelry that gleams in the flickering floodlights. Her face bears the same expression as the driver, smiling, unblinking, completely frozen, almost like it's painted on her face. Hoping to get this done as quick as possible, Joe and Austin head to either side of the car and open the doors to begin the inspection. And right away, they see something weird. It takes up the entire back seat, although it's mostly covered with a blanket. A corner peeking out from underneath indicates that the couple are carrying an immense metal cage in their car. What the heck? Austin cautiously reached one hand in. With shaking fingers, he flicks a corner of the blanket to the side to see what is in the cage, and all he sees at first is long, dark, black hair. And he's thinking, thank God it's just a dog. But as he thinks that, he starts to wonder. Nothing else about tonight has been routine, and why would they suddenly get lucky with something as boring as a dog? So he lifts the blanket a little more, dipping his head just inside the rear, and now he catches a glimpse of something else in the cage. The gleam of metal. A bowl for food, looks like, and something else brightly colored and rubbery. A squeaky toy? Maybe it is just a dog, but they have to do their job. They have to get the cage out. So Austin starts pushing on the cage and it just won't budge an inch. It's just too big and heavy. So he gets Joe to help him lift the cage off the seat enough to slide it out one of the doors, but it still won't budge. Whatever is inside must weigh well over 100 pounds, maybe even a few. All this time, the blanket is still covering the cage, and so Austin and Joe ask Bill to come help. And now all three of them are half in, half out of the car, and the couple is just standing there watching them wriggle the cage out of the backseat, still smiling and wide-eyed. And it's nearing the edge, and that's when all hell breaks loose. The cage tumbles off the back seat onto the ground. The instant it lands, something from beneath the blanket lets loose a blood-curdling scream. And not an animal scream either. A scream like a human being. Whatever is inside, folks, it ain't no dog. The impact of the cage against the ground sends the door flying open. In a flash, something darker than the night itself scuttles out, and Austin's first thought is that it's some sort of gigantic spider, but in the flickering illumination of the floodlights, Austin sees that this wasn't a spider, because whatever this is, it doesn't have claws or paws. It's got what looks like hands, and it's covered from top to bottom in dark, glossy fur. And as he watches the animal whirl around in the sand, his first thought is that, oh my gosh, this couple has a pet chimpanzee, but it's moving too fast to be certain. And whatever it is about 5 feet 10 inches tall and as muscular as a bodybuilder. Moving on 2 feet, it darts around the car to the guardhouse, around the guardhouse, back again, back around the car at the edge of the headlights, never stopping but never running too far away. And now, Austin gets a good look at this thing's face, and what he sees confuses him even more. It doesn't look like a monkey. It looks more like a person, only with much larger jaws. And all of its features, especially its jaws, seem disturbingly human. But it's way too fast and wild to be human, so what is it? And weirdest of all, Austin thinks that he caught a glimpse of a white tag on one of its ears. You know, the same kind of tags that scientists put on wildlife that they're monitoring in the wilderness, or a kind of tag a farmer puts in the ear of their livestock. And until now, this thing has just been darting around them, barely fast enough to see. But from out of the darkness, a black shape leaps into the air and lands on Bill, sending him tumbling to the ground. All Austin can see is a flurry of motion as this thing starts relentlessly pummeling Bill. Bill tries fighting off his attacker, but it's no use. With one hand, he pushes back on the chimpanzee, and with the other, he reaches down to his Glock, which is still in its holster at his hip, but there's just too much commotion. He can't get a grip. So Austin, acting completely instinctively, unholsters his own sidearm. It'll be a tricky shot to hit this thing and not hit Bill, but someone has to do something. Austin looks down his sights, lets his finger slide onto the trigger, but Austin is distracted by the feeling of someone touching his shoulder. And he stops and he looks, and it's the old man, still smiling, still wide-eyed. And the driver hisses, "Don't shoot, don't shoot," in the same icy cold voice he's been using all night. The driver then places his hand on Austin's arms, forcing them in the direction of the ground, and takes a step toward Bill and this, whatever it is. And now all Austin can do is just take in the scene unfolding before him. The driver seems to have something in his hand. So Austin, nervous and not trusting the man, watches closely, and a moment later he sees that what the driver's holding is actually an enormous syringe. The kind that you would imagine you would use to tranquilize an elephant. The driver waits for an opening, then jabs it right into the neck and depresses the plunger with his thumb. Now, it takes a few heartbeats for the sedative to kick in, and the blows to Bill's chest became slower and more sluggish. Finally, about 10 seconds after, it loses control of its muscles and kind of just collapses down to the ground, there in the dirt alongside Bill. Now, Austin finally gets a good look at his coworker. Bill stumbles up and kneels, and he's got blood pouring from his nose into the dirt. He's an absolute mess. Not only did the thing break his nose, but Austin sees that Bill will be nursing a pair of black eyes in the coming days. Bill even spits out a fragment from a tooth, or several. Joe rushes to Bill's side. Meanwhile, the creepy couple are just preoccupied with this animal. They start dragging its limp body through the sand until they reach the cage and start stuffing the animal back inside. Now, since Joe is taking care of Bill, Austin confronts the couple and he's like, "What is that? Do you realize what you've done? Do you even have a license to own something that dangerous? Are you even listening?" And it's like Austin isn't even there. Neither the man nor the woman acknowledges his questions. Moving almost robotically, they simply secure the animal in its cage, and only when this is done does the driver finally turn around to Austin, who is still asking them a string of questions in fury and panic. The driver, still with the same smile, says in a machine-like tone, "Apologies for the inconvenience. I'm what you call a licensed zoologist. I am transporting an endangered primate for a study. I have the proper credentials." With that, from out of nowhere, the man presents a stack of paperwork. Austin does his best to make sense of it, but without being well versed in the ins and outs of exotic wildlife ownership, he has to admit that everything seems in order. There are licenses, degrees, paperwork, the whole 9 yards, and Austin reluctantly hands in the papers back to the driver. The old man again apologizes, and for the first time since the Lincoln drove up to the checkpoint, the man's smile fades. And now there's nothing but a blank expression, and it is chilling because there's a message in that expression. And the expression says, "This is over and we are leaving." Now in that moment, Austin is profoundly disturbed, but he gets the message. He fumbles through some words, almost in a trance, and all he can muster is, it's okay. It was our bad." And Austin sees that the woman's expression has gone blank as well. He tells Joe to keep looking after Bill while he helps the couple haul the cage back into the back seat. Now, as quickly as he can, Austin finishes the inspection. He just wants this night to be over. At last, it's all done. Austin heads back to the guardhouse and presses the button to lift the gate. And as he does so, he notices that the couple is staring at him with these same cold, soulless, unblinking eyes. Austin later said that he had never felt so uncomfortable in his entire life. Now, once the gate lifts, the driver makes it a point to keep his eyes locked on Austin. He cruises on through, flashing that nasty yellow smile one final time as he passes into America. Strangely, the power at the checkpoint returned to normal the instant the Lincoln's taillight passed into the darkness beyond the checkpoint. Only then did Austin regroup with Joe and Bill. The three of them reported the incident, but of course, no one higher up on the chain of command ever really seemed to show any interest or followed up. Bill was taken to the emergency room, of course, and made a full recovery. But Austin, on the other hand, never did recover. Because while Bill's injuries were physical, Austin's scars were psychological. Nothing about that night in 2006 ever made sense. And as a result, he became increasingly paranoid. He lived with the sensation of being watched. Looking out his bedroom window at night became impossible. And within a few years, he had resigned from his position as a Border Patrol agent. And he did not regret it one bit. Now later, he heard that Bill eventually resigned too. And as far as he knew, Joe still lived in New Mexico, although it wasn't clear whether or not he was still with the CBP. All Austin knew was that that night would stay with him until the day he died, because there are things out there that do go bump in the night, and we are completely helpless against them. And because all of you watching this have reached the end, I want you to all comment below apologies for the inconvenience underneath this video, so that way I'll know which of you made it to the end and which of you didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we just dive into strange cases of the mysterious and the supernatural, then what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. And as always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next video.